of minutes to
Vamos a darle un par de
hold on.
minutos a que todo el mundo entre.
Come on in and take your virtual seats. My name is Rachel Hutchison.
Yo soy Rachel Hutchinson.
We are just about ready to get started with
Estamos ya a
today's
punto de
webinar.
empezar para el seminario de hoy en línea.
Before we do that, I'm going to let
Antes de
Jose
empezar,
give you
quiero
instructions
que
on how to enter our Spanish interpretation room.
yo les voy a dar información sobre cómo entrar a la interpretación en español si le hace falta. A cualquier persona que le haga falta la interpretación en español, por favor, déjenlo saber y confirmen que necesitan español.
Thank
Oh,
you. Interpretation is now on. If you would like to hear this presentation in Spanish, you can use the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select Spanish. Welcome, everybody. Today, we are joined by some fabulous speakers who are going to give us some really great tips on how to have conversations with our kiddos on tough topics. Couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. This session is being recorded, so if you want to share it with someone afterwards, feel free. If that person would like to get a certificate of completion and they were not here live, we also have this available as an online course, free, so that they can also receive a certificate for having gone through this 1 hour training. Okay, so today I'm going to not spend any other time talking here. I'm going to give you over to our experts. I am very pleased to hand the reins over to Miss Maureen Leary, Emily Porter, and Julia Smith, who are here from Smithsonian Education to talk about how we can use museum resources to help us have tough conversations with our kiddos. Take it away, friends.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and to the National Head Start Association for inviting us to do this presentation with you today. We are so excited to see so much interest in this topic. My name is Maureen Leary. I am the Youth and Family Programs Manager at the Smithsonian National Postal Museum. And I also spent over 2 decades at the Smithsonian Early Enrichment Center, which is a school we have at the Smithsonian for infants through kindergarten. So I spent time in the classroom for many years, and I also worked as a center director in that space. So I come to you with a variety of experiences working with young children in both school and museum contexts.
Hi, everybody. I'm Emily Porter. I'm the manager of early childhood and family learning at the Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology. I have worked here supporting young children exploring animals and science and getting them comfortable in nature for over 10 years now, and just really an advocate for all of our families and increasing the representation at the zoo. I'm also the mother of a 5-year-old, and so he is our little test subject for a lot of our work that we do here with Get a Head Start with the Smithsonian.
Hello, it's so great to be here. I'm Julia Smith. I'm a museum and early learning specialist over at the Smithsonian Early Enrichment Center, which, as Maureen said, is our on-site childcare early learning center. We're a full-time school. I used to be a classroom toddler educator until I moved into this role. So I kind of understand what it's like to be with those littles and in the classroom, and also thinking about how to incorporate museum resources and also having those, those tough conversations that you have as a teacher. So we'll go to our next slide. We want to acknowledge that this is part of a project called Get a Head Start with the Smithsonian. It's a collaboration between the Smithsonian Institution and the National Head Start Association, and is funded in part by the Jeff Bezos gift to the National Air and Space Museum. And we thank the Office of the Undersecretary for Education at the Smithsonian for their support of this project, which also involves virtual field trips that you may have gone on, and lots of resources for how to incorporate the Smithsonian's resources into your classroom. Go to the next slide. So welcome. We're so happy to have you here. We are a large group, but we would love to have some interaction. You can engage by using the chat, as all of you are doing. I love seeing all of these introductions. We'll also have a quick poll that we're going to turn on in just a second to kind of get a sense of what age groups are represented here today. So we'll go to the next slide. And most of you are already doing this, but if you haven't already, let us know where you're joining from, and definitely let us know what you're excited to learn. We want to know kind of what brought you to this course today. That would be great. You can also answer that poll to give us a sense of what ages you're typically working with, just to, get an idea of who's here today. So thank you all so much for sharing. It looks like we have such a great representation from all over the country. I'm seeing the poll has just gone up, so feel free to fill that in. Yeah, we're looking pretty well split kind of between infants and toddlers, maybe a little bit more preschool or some both. That makes sense. That makes sense. Excellent. Thank you all so much for putting those in the chat. All right. Let's go to our next slide and talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. So we have a few goals for this presentation. Our hope is that you will, in the course of this hour with us, consider why it's important to address these tough questions, these tough topics with young children. We hope that we'll explore different strategies for addressing complicated content and celebrating differences in people. We hope to learn how to create a supportive community of adults and peers to strengthen children's ability to explore these complex topics and discover helpful resources from the Smithsonian at the end. And you will also get a lovely email with lots of resources as well. We'll go to the next slide and start with why the Smithsonian? Why the Smithsonian? Why do we want to talk about this with you all? We'll go to the next slide, but with the Smithsonian, our collections, the art and the objects and things in the collection, they can introduce powerful ideas and stories of people who are change agents and role models for young children. And some of those stories are really complicated and, no human being is perfect. So the stories about the people that are stored in the Smithsonian are imperfect as well. So because of that, our educators are uniquely suited to talk about things that are a little bit complicated and not perfect and don't fit neatly into nice boxes and help hold that nuance with children. Think about things from many different angles. So that's why this is such an important topic to us and why we're here today. So what makes a topic sensitive? There are a lot of different topics that could be sensitive, but we'll go to the next slide and talk about a few possibilities. Usually these are topics that make us uncomfortable for whatever reason. Maybe it's because we don't know the answer or because we do, but it's not something that everybody agrees on, or we have our answer, but somebody else might have a different answer. These might be controversial topics where people disagree. And these might be topics that you or the people around you were taught not to talk about, things that were maybe kind of ignored or, thought to maybe not be polite to talk about. And that can make it really hard to talk about as an adult if you weren't given the space to talk about it as a child. So that's kind of broadly what a sensitive topic could be. So I'd like you to put in the chat, we'll go to the next slide and put it up on the screen, but what topics feel uncomfortable or tough for you to talk about in your classroom? These could be topics that have come up before, that maybe a child has asked you and you've been kind of like, I do not know how to address that. Or they could be topics that you maybe haven't encountered with a child, but you thought about and you were like, I don't know what I would say. Death. Yes. Oh, safe touches. Yeah, that's interesting. Death of a parent. Yes. Divorce, touch, how we interact with each other, those relationships. Hygiene. Oh, that's an interesting one. Yeah, but that could be something where maybe it's uncomfortable. It feels rude to talk about it, maybe possibly. Or parent in jail, substance abuse. Yes. When children say they're a specific gender and another child tells them they're wrong. Yes. Gender, same-sex relationships, trauma. Yeah. Oh, and a child is severely injured. Yeah, that's an interesting one too. Both with maybe talking to the child about what's happened to them, but then also having to talk to that parent about, okay, here's what happened. Incarceration, racism. Yes, absolutely. Gender, guns. Yes. Yeah. These are all definitely, yeah, yeah. So I'm seeing a lot of things. So things about human differences and some things that are like maybe scary for children, like violence or death, things like that. Classmates with exceptionalities or disabilities, yes, kind of like how are they different? Yes. These are all great. Thank you. Feel free to keep putting them in the chat. These are really excellent. But we're going to go to the next slide. And we're going to talk about some of those aspects. One of the things that a lot of you talked about is this idea of differences. We are all unique, different human beings, and children are naturally curious and they see these differences from a very young age. There's a lot of research about children being able to see differences in their caregivers. And these differences are wonderful. They are what makes us unique, but children notice them and they might be curious about them. So we'll go to the next slide. And they're curious and they might make incorrect conclusions because of that curiosity. So children learn by connecting new information to information they already have. If you've ever learned about Piaget, it's kind of like schema theory. They build on what they have to add new information to it. So if they're encountering a difference that they've never seen before, they're going to try to understand that difference using their prior knowledge. And that may cause them to make connections that are just not accurate or not really in line with your values as a teacher, their values in their family. They just might not be making those connections in a clear way. So when children might ask tough questions because they're kind of asking, should these things that I'm relating together be related? Or they might make statements to you that are kind of like, is this correct? Or they may have already fully processed it and they're saying things or asking questions that reflect that. So when children are asking these tough questions or they're making statements that sort of indicate they have made this not so great connection, we can start by considering what they already know and think about the connection they may have made. We'll go to the next slide and talk a little bit about how to do that. So using their prior knowledge, you want to think about what a child may already know that's prompting them to ask or say something. And you can acknowledge their statement in concrete terms. Oh, you're saying this. Kind of confirm a little bit with them. Like, do you think this? Have you made this connection? And then acknowledge the incorrect information. Just say, oh, it seems like you think this. That's actually not true. It's this. You can give them an opportunity to share what made them ask that question or make that connection because they're just trying to learn. That's what children do. They didn't do anything necessarily wrong by trying to learn something, but we can still correct them. We can provide new information in age-appropriate ways. This can be tricky, but mainly it just means keeping it really simple and then adding more as the child maybe asks follow-up questions or seems additionally curious. You could add more, but just at the base, keeping it really simple. And then you can take that opportunity to celebrate differences and say, oh, actually, here's the reason that we're different. Isn't that so wonderful that we're different and we're not all the same? So building on that prior knowledge and kind of helping them to take new information and process it in a way that it just makes a little bit more sense. We'll go to the next one. So building a bridge to understanding. So we at the Smithsonian, we often work with objects because we have a lot of objects around them. And we think that using objects are really powerful ways to help children make connections. We'll go to the next slide. We know that you all probably don't have museum collection objects in your classroom. Even at Seek, we don't really have that, but we have lots of everyday objects and things like toys and all of that. And we can use those to help teach children and help have these conversations. So using these everyday objects from children's daily life, it really meets them kind of where they are, we were talking about, with the knowledge they already have, using things that are familiar to them. And then caregivers can use that foundation as a bridge to discuss maybe less familiar things. And this can be in the context of tricky topics or in any kind of learning. Objects can just be a really great way to ground children in what they already know and in things that are familiar to them. You can go to the next slide. Children are really concrete learners. So objects are really great because they are physical. They can handle them, they can touch them. They can get that kind of full sensory experience with them, and really engage with them from a lot of different angles. Objects are also really great because it can allow children to practice their observation skills. And in doing that, there's really no wrong way to have an observation. They might think an object is something completely different than what it actually is, but that observation can tell us so much about how they learn, who they are, experiences they've had in the past with similar objects. It's just a really great way to get a different perspective on that child and help other children have other perspectives of how somebody else might see an object or might use it. So that's a really great thing about objects, is that they really, there's no wrong answers almost when you're using them. It just sort of shows you the different ways that people think. And then you can go forward and say, oh, well, you may not recognize this object that child has. Many children don't know what old-fashioned phones look like. I'm sure they'll go like this. But their observations are valid, and you as the teacher can learn from them, and they can learn from how they got to the guesses they had for what it was. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Maureen, who is going to talk to us more about how to respond in the moment when tough topics come up.
Thank you so much, Julia. And actually, before we get to the how, we're going to talk a little bit more about the why. Why is this so important? I think, we as adults certainly are familiar with that feeling of not wanting to have a certain conversation, feeling uncomfortable around discussing a topic with other adults. And then when you take it to this situation of doing it with a child, it can feel even more weighty and consequential, because we know that children really look to us for answers. They really put a lot of weight on the words that we say to them. And so we do need to be really careful with that. We don't want to be cavalier with that sort of power that we have in those situations. So it really can often feel so much easier to just to brush off or ignore those topics when we're not sure exactly what to say. But it's really important to remember that we do not have to have the perfect response ready in the moment in order to move that conversation forward in a productive way. So saying something is almost always better than saying nothing. Even if it's as simple as just acknowledging what the child said, it can still impart a strong message. And this kind of is underscoring some of what Julia was talking about. We're just going to take the conversation a little bit further in this section. So if we can go to the next slide. So when you take the time to respond to these inquiries from children, you're really helping to reinforce their sense of self. So again, we've all had that experience, not only of having to have uncomfortable conversations, but also that feeling of, you say something maybe in a meeting or maybe in a one-on-one conversation or with a coworker or even a spouse, and you feel brushed off, ignored, discounted. And that, we don't like that as adults, of course. But I hope in most of the time we understand how to put that in perspective. And we understand that people are coming from all different situations. There might be a lot of things we don't understand that are going on in the background that we might not know about. There could be a lot of reasons why somebody reacts to us the way they do, and maybe why they can't give what we say their full attention. But children are very keen observers, and our reactions to them are really magnified. So they don't generally have the same level of intellectual and emotional capacity to really fully contextualize comments that they hear from us. So it's helpful if we make sure that we answer whatever they're saying to us in a really calm and measured way, not kind of overreacting, acting like they said something disturbing or upsetting, but staying very calm, avoiding letting our personal opinions interfere with what we may have heard them say, and just making sure that above all, we convey that their words are important. Their words are always important. And we want to value that even if we can't get into a full conversation in that moment or give them the perfect answer that we want to give in that moment, we are taking at least the amount of time that it requires to say, I hear you. What you're saying is important. If we can go to the next slide. And part of the reason this is important is, if we do ignore these things that come up from children or brush them off, that the children can easily interpret that as, you just don't care about that topic. You don't think it's important enough to talk about, or that if they said something that's rooted in a misconception, that maybe you agree and that actually is the correct assumption that they made. So that's, as I said, the children really amplify and magnify the opinions and statements from adults they trust and respect. So, and this can feel very weighty when you're in that position with a child, but it also is an opportunity to be an avenue for helping them get to greater understanding of these really complicated topics that come up with children, because they are deep thinkers, even if they're still really young. And as the slide says, sensitive topics are sensitive because they matter, because they are complicated and they are nuanced, and they do take some real thought to talk about in a way that's positive and helpful for children as they navigate these things without having that fuller context that we have as adults. So in the next slide, we can also think about how we are trying to establish ourselves as a safe guide for them. So as I mentioned, sometimes, of course, it feels safer to say nothing when children ask challenging questions. We get so scared of saying the wrong thing. I know that's happened to me many times in these situations. But then when that happens, you're placing that burden on the child to figure it out. If they're asking you, they want to know the answer, right? That seems obvious, but it's so important to remember. They are trying to grow their understanding of a concept or a topic. And they're always going to construct their own meaning in that void if we don't help them, if we don't step in and give a little guidance and give them that fuller picture. They're going to go ahead and fill it in with whatever details they already are familiar with. As Julia mentioned earlier, the whole idea of building on prior knowledge, and they work with what they already know. They are constantly constructing meaning, but that doesn't mean they're always doing it in a way that leads them to a conclusion that is accurate or helpful. I keep thinking back to an anecdote that was related to our team by a Head Start staff person. She was at a Head Start center with a balloon one day, and a child came up to her and asked who died. And she was so confused by this. And it was interesting because when Julia asked you to mention in the chat some tough topics, death came up over and over and over. Clearly, children are aware of death, but it's scary to talk about death with kids. We don't want them to think they're going to die, their parents are going to die, but it is something that's on their minds, clearly, right? And so this child asked about the balloon and who died, and they finally got to the bottom of it. And this child had experiences seeing memorials placed at a spot, maybe a car crash or something where somebody had died, and they had seen balloons there and associated that with death. And so that was where their mind immediately went, even though this balloon was intended to be celebratory. It required some explanation to get there for that child to understand that balloons don't only mean death; they can mean a lot of things. So again, it's just it's really just helpful to celebrate that trust that the children put in us and use it as an opportunity to guide students and help them be open-minded to taking in more information before they make a conclusion about something. So on the next slide, this is, I think anybody who's worked with especially really young kids, toddlers, twos, we see how much they just parrot the people around them, the things they see around them. They're just constantly mimicking, whether it's in speech or in movements or behavior. They learn from the people around them, and particularly adults. So they're not born with that sense of knowing what's right and wrong. They're constantly trying to take that information in from the adults around them. So this is really just a reminder that I think everyone in this session, I'm sure, has some understanding of this, that kids do model their behavior off of us, and they even if they're not mimicking what they see. They're certainly taking it in and observing it. So it is important to be modeling not just in those interactions between adults and children, but also between adults, modeling that respect and that inquiry and that sort of mutual goal of understanding each other and understanding the world better. Next slide, please. So we've talked a little bit about why it's so important to respond in the moment rather than brushing it off, ignoring, not acknowledging. But that can be really hard to do, right? So we're going to take a minute now to talk about what are some strategies for trying to do that, because we know it's really a challenge and can be very daunting. Next slide. So one of the first things that I have found helpful, and I know a lot of colleagues I've worked with over the years have found helpful, is when you hear something that maybe feels startling from a child, to take a step back, and instead of assuming what is prompting that statement from them or that question from them, just stop and ask those open-ended questions that give them a chance to let you know, rather than you putting your meaning onto the situation. Just really simple questions. What makes you say that? Well, how does that make you feel when that happened? Have you seen something like that before? What do you think that word means? That last question, I feel like, is one that I've personally have used so much, because that's where you can run into a lot of unintentional misunderstanding when kids are using words that they think they know what they mean, but they don't. And so that can be a great way to find out what is their intention in saying that. And sometimes, maybe they do have an intention that isn't so great and you need to address that, but often that's not the case. And it's just, they don't really even understand what they're saying. So that taking that time to just have that conversation and just dig in a little bit can really help guide those conversations. And you don't have to go into those knowing what you're going to say. You just can be open to seeing where the conversation goes. Next slide. So, and then sometimes, of course, it can happen where you don't have the time to stop and take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it is, for a longer conversation. And so you might be tempted to just okay, I'm just gonna pretend I didn't hear that and move on. But it can, take 10 seconds, 15 seconds, to even just to acknowledge what the child has said, and then tell them you'll talk about it more later. So the language on the slide says, it's interesting to me that you said that. I want to find out more about the way you're thinking. How about we find a time to talk when it's quieter? And the thing I love about phrasing it this way is you can use something like this in a situation one-on-one with a child, with this. Maybe there's 2 or 3 kids sitting with you reading a book. Maybe you're doing circle time. This is something you can say to any number of kids at the same time. And it's perfectly appropriate. And all of them are hearing it and understanding that, okay, that adult knows this is important, wants to hear more about it, but we just can't do it right now. I mean, most kids understand from a pretty young age, that there's a schedule. And I mean, most preschool classrooms especially have sort of the daily schedule they follow, and kids really understand that. And so just kind of saying, we'll talk about it a little bit later, that not only is useful in a practical sense in terms of how your day flows, but it also gives you time to think about it a little bit more if you need that. So that can be a really helpful strategy for honoring the child and their curiosity and confusion, but not necessarily having to drop everything and figure it out right in the moment. Next slide, please. So role playing is another one that's a bit more of a deliberate strategy in how you set up your classroom, and something that you might practice a bit with your students or the children you care for. But I love this one. I've seen this used in many settings in a really effective way, especially when you can build characters that students become familiar with, and then even give them some ownership of the way these characters are responding in different situations, and how they interact with each other. And it can give the child who feels confused about something a way to voice that and talk about it that's a little bit removed and doesn't necessarily feel like they are being so directly vulnerable about it. And with some kids are an open book, they don't mind, they'll talk about it all day. Some kids need, I think, a little bit more space, a little bit more removal from the tough topic. And this can be a really nice way to give them that chance to talk something through where doesn't feel quite as personal. And so again, this is something that becomes more effective over time as you sort of practice it with your students. And so it can be something that you don't wait until something comes up, but just kind of build it in as part of your circle time or once a week or whatever that is, just so then when the time comes and a child does want to have a conversation where this might be an appropriate strategy to use, they're already familiar with it and feel comfortable with it and can yield really more information and more positive results from that. Next slide, please. And this one I feel like is so important, and I would actually love to hear from the audience. So when we created this professional development session, we very deliberately did not focus on any specific topics. And this was partly in response to doing a sort of feedback session with the National Head Start Association staff, because, this audience and the Head Start centers are scattered all over the country, and communities look different wherever you are, and Head Start classrooms look different, and what issues might come up in one may not be an issue at all in another. And so I'm curious if any of you would be willing to share. Maybe you can put in the chat, what are some issues that might come up for you that a child might approach you with where you feel like, I really don't want to get into any detail with this child. This is really more appropriate for the family to talk about, because you might have a different way of explaining or thinking about this than the family will, and you don't want to overstep, you don't want to make anybody uncomfortable. And the one that comes to mind for me is gender identity. But what I'm seeing in the chat, I'm seeing religion come up a few times, holidays, which I would say is tied in with religion, divorce. So these are, and death is another one that's come up a lot today. And gender identity, I see someone has echoed that I had said. Something a family member has said, the child is relaying to you. Wow, that's a tough one. That's a really tough one. And that probably is one where you want to get more people involved. So this can be any kind of thing, socioeconomic status, and it really, like I said, it depends on the demographics of your classroom. It depends on the demographics of your community, your families, the interpersonal dynamics between the teachers, the staff at the center, the families, all of those kinds of things. So it's perfectly okay this is sort of going back to that, acknowledge and defer, where that's a really important thing you brought up, but we're going to talk about that later. So it's a similar strategy, but instead you could say, that's a great conversation for you to have with an adult at home. And I can mention it to your person at home if you want me to, if you feel okay with that. And then this is also a really good opportunity to loop in parent engagement staff at Head Start centers and to build on that partnership between the center and the families and make sure everybody feels heard and respected in those interactions. And, we don't want to ignore what children say. I think we've laid that out really clearly. We definitely never want to ignore, but we also don't always have to be the ones to figure out the right words or decide what are the parameters we're going to put on this conversation. What are the pieces of information we're going to give versus maybe withhold till they're a little bit older and can understand better, that kind of thing. So this is one that I think comes up no matter where you work, no matter what your family structures look like. There are always going to be those issues where it's probably better for the families to handle it in the way that feels the best for them, rather than the school taking on that role. Next slide, please. And I am now going to hand it off to Emily to talk about our next section. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maureen. And I just saw somebody in the chat ask a question, so we're following up on that about what happens, what should we do if a child says it's not okay to mention? I think that's such an important thing to bring up because, and that's something we're going to get into here with the safe space for questions, because you are a trusted adult that they're coming to, especially that sounds like they don't feel safe in another environment. So, I think that's a time where I would definitely rely so much on talking to your parent staff, talking to your co-teachers, and find out a little bit more about the situation. But yeah, I think that's definitely something where just being that trusted adult for the child and acknowledging that they have come to you for a very particular reason, that you are someone that makes them feel safe, and honoring that bond, I think, in order to encourage future discussions as well is important. So, Julia, Maureen, I don't know if there's anything else you would want to add to that. I just thought that was an important one to note.
Yeah, I think kind of Maureen mentioned it when we were going through, but like trying to get more context from the child, what makes you say that? Kind of trying to be neutral and get just like a little bit more context, I think can sometimes be really, could be helpful. But I totally echo like, talk to other adults who maybe know the child and have a little bit more, maybe who have more insight into why the child might say that. But yeah, I would definitely encourage like information gathering both within your team with other adults and, as appropriate with the child.
Yeah, and I would just add one more quick thing that depending on what the topic is, I know that certainly at the Smithsonian School, we understand that we are mandated reporters if it comes to something like potential abuse of a child. So if it is that, then that's of course, as much as we don't want to betray a child's confidence, if they say don't say anything, we still have that responsibility to, move it through the appropriate channels and make sure that that child is being taken care of. If it's a different topic that's not quite so urgent in that way, then I think that's a little bit more nuanced, and it probably just varies, situation to situation. But thanks, Emily.
Hey, thanks, guys. We are definitely a great team answering these. We're here for you guys. All right, so I am going to take over the sections about how to create those safe spaces where children feel okay and comfortable coming to you to ask those questions. So let's just go ahead to the next slide, please. So we're going to talk about how to create that safe space, and then give you a couple of resources to do that as well. So really, what is that safe space and what is it in your classroom? And really, it starts with a caring classroom community. So really, one of the most important things that you can do to support young children exploring these sensitive topics is to make your classroom into that place where young children feel comfortable bringing up those topics that they're wrestling with, but might not have a place to talk about otherwise. I think both Maureen and Julia spoke to the idea that of just how important it is to not let children feel alone in addressing these topics, both because it just leaves them at a very young age wrestling with these really tricky topics that they are not really cognitively developed enough to process in a lot of ways, but also it could very easily lead to them drawing mistaken conclusions and leading to further questions down the road too. So really, how can we really support that classroom where it's safe to bring up those topics? And so, as we noted, you are a trusted, safe adult, but we want to make sure that when we talk about a caring classroom community, that also takes into account the other students in the classroom. And so making sure that all the students in the classroom really feel comfortable being their full selves in front of each other and asking honest questions among their peers. So we'll go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about where that starts, because it really starts with helping each child build a positive self-identity. So that's how they see themselves and their whole selves. And do they see their whole selves in a positive way? So when they feel positive about themselves and all of their attributes, when they are confident that they are of value, that they are worthy of love and respect, and they're worthy of consideration and equal treatment, that's the first step to helping them understand that other people are also worthy of those same things as well, and really starts building the foundations of a community. As we know, young children's brains are rapidly developing, and they are at a key part in the process of learning how to take the perspectives of others And then how to feel and exercise empathy, which is the ability to understand and value how other people might be thinking or feeling. So the strategies that we're about to talk about a little bit, these are going to be ways to help really support young children's positive sense of self-identity, but then also support perspective taking and empathy for development. So next slide. All right, so the first thing we could do is just really reinforce students' positive self-identity. They're being bombarded with all kinds of messages every day, and unfortunately, the big topics that can lead to some sensitive questions, racism, sexism, a lot of that really does end up in all of our messages that they get throughout the day. So how can we make our classroom a space where we can reinforce that every child has unique value? And I love this particular image where, a child is looking in the mirror and they have the opportunity to take off that Post-it and put a new word on there to define what the positive trait is that they value about themselves. And so right there, we're starting with I am strong, but what else is wonderful about you as a person, and giving children that voice to identify those traits and features. And again, that starts to help them understand that others have those same traits as well. So next slide. All right, so we'd love to hear, before we get into this, what are some ways that you guys are already promoting a sense of community in your classroom, creating a place where students celebrate the differences, and feel free to talk about them. If you want to put that in the chat, that would be awesome. I can't wait to see. All right, creating a school family, that's a great one. Having classroom helpers, which can mean helping peers. I love that. It's giving kids that sort of autonomy and that role. Learning about different cultures, absolutely, and having a quiet space, having large group discussions. All have jobs and work together to keep each other safe. Yes, that's fantastic language. Are you feeling activity in the morning with peers? Great. Identifying and speaking to children's individual skills, absolutely. Reading books about differences. Oh, I'm going to call out this title. Some Bodies Need a Little Help. That's one that Sydney Harris is suggesting. I'm going to go check that out. Classroom rules of no bullying and respecting others. Absolutely. Teamwork. Bringing pictures from home to make a class book of the family. Thank you, Deborah. That's awesome. Family photos and walls. Inviting community leaders to come speak with kids. That's great. All right, and allowing children to communicate with others, having expectations. That's a really great thing that we just sometimes don't even think about. But yes, having expectations and voicing those to each other of how do we expect each other to respect one another. All right, this is great. I'm already seeing some of the strategies we're going to talk about. So that is fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. All right, can we go to the next slide? All right, so I'm seeing a lot of these of ideas that sort of underlie this topic here, but yes, representation and making your classroom a place where difficult subjects feel safe to bring up by showing and highlighting and valuing and really just celebrating all the wonderful differences that make us special, make us unique. So in these supportive classroom communities, when we really focus on representation, we're normalizing and we're celebrating differences. So it makes it okay for kids to ask questions. All right, so let's go to the next slide. We'll look at some strategies. All right, so we saw a lot of ways that that we're sort of celebrating kids' unique skills. And one of those is really celebrating that unique you. So one great way that I love doing this is really putting pictures of all of our kids around and also their artwork, hanging it up everywhere all over the classroom. I know we already do that a lot of times just because, kids love seeing their artwork, but really think about what message that sends underneath it too in terms of representation. It's allowing us to, make them, their image, their photograph, or the work that they create visible and prevalent within the classroom and their classmates' experience. So it's really centering the child and validating them and their work. The other thing that you could do here is to sort of print out artwork from museums around, from other classrooms in the center, from family homes if they have special artwork at home, and put them on the wall too, and then use that to sort of playfully engage students in that artwork, so that represent that diversity of the classroom, just new ways to highlight it and inspire additional work. So kids could dress up like the characters they see in the artwork. They could pose like the figures in the artwork and really putting themselves in that work. And the Smithsonian has wonderful tools for finding fantastic artwork. We've got some of those coming up at the end for great places where you can find kid-friendly biographies of artists and really wonderful, rich artworks that you can hang up to sort of celebrate diversity and find ways to spark conversation about it. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so storytelling. We all know how powerful storytelling and storybooks can be. They give children a way to experience a situation from a safe distance, and gives them a way to either experience, a situation through a character or just model something. And Maureen spoke a little bit about acknowledging and deferring difficult questions. So giving yourself the opportunity to tell a child, well, it's really interesting that you asked that and acknowledge that you heard it, but then follow up on that with a bit of distance. And using books is a great way to do that. So you can use a book or use story time as a concrete opportunity to provide that follow-up. So saying, it's so interesting to me that you said that. I think I know a book that might help us answer that question. Or I think I read a book where I saw somebody dealing with something like that. Can we make a date at story time, or can we maybe share that with our friends at circle time? And Laura just put in the chat a couple of wonderful resources for books that deal with subjects that often come up and can be challenging. So finding a diversity of books and really making sure that the books in your classroom have inclusive characters, use multiple languages when possible, and celebrate different cultures. So marking those calendar dates and bringing in the heritages of all the different cultures in your classroom. So next slide, please. And related to that, in that sense of some children needing distance between themselves and an issue, play with dolls and figures is a wonderful way to support young children's ability to take the perspective of others and develop empathy. So that gives them that way to explore those ideas in a safe and child-directed way, so they really can control how they are processing that. So play with dolls, with figures, allows them to practice caring behaviors, to practice caring for others, just as they care for themselves. And then when you, as the adult, join into that play, it allows you to model those same caring, inclusive behaviors and show children how to take the perspectives of others. We know they're watching us all the time. So this gives us a great way and gives us an excuse to play too. And who doesn't love that? So similarly with our book area, just looking and making sure that if possible in your toy area, you've got dolls or figures or puzzles, anything that represent multiple skin colors, hair, clothing styles, ability levels. And donations are a great way to do this if you need to diversify that area, seeking out those toys from other sources. So next slide, please. All right, and as we saw in the chat, lots of folks are already doing this, but yes, featuring your families, bringing in those rich community histories and backgrounds and all of the wonderful resources that exist in that family that you already have in your school. So really celebrate that unique classroom community and highlight the families that exist within the classroom, that wonderful network. Making a family heritage week, National Heritage Week, whether it is having family members come in, having community leaders come in, and really just sharing all the wonderful histories that make up the community that exists in the classroom. All right, next slide, please. All right. And then another wonderful strategy for really helping to create that sense of classroom community is using artwork and opportunities for self-exploration and self-expression. So, you know, drawing, painting, making things helps children of all ages process these complex topics. It gives them the freedom of expression to explore those ideas and questions. It also gives you a really great concrete object to sort of assess and understand a little bit more about what the child is thinking and how they're thinking about things. So it's sort of a concrete way of asking that question, what makes you say that? So, oh, and I'm seeing in there, Karen is posting in the chat, 20 toys and games around the world. So thank you so much. That is wonderful. All right. Yes, absolutely. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so one of our favorite ways to really celebrate differences and use that sort of self-expression is through self-portraits. Really creating those self-portraits that helps kids really reinforce that sense of themselves. It's a great way for kids to express how they see themselves, to reflect on, you know, what things they love about themselves, what things they want to express to others about themselves. And it gives you as the teacher a really wonderful sort of place to start out a conversation about what you notice about the child as well. So, you know, when you're sitting down with a child working on their self-portrait, you can sort of start having those conversations that's just as you see them working, narrating what you see them doing, but also acknowledging those features that you love about the child that perhaps might not be something that they necessarily think of when they're, you know, drawing their self-portrait. You can get into sort of the more underlying features of, you know, they're drawing their mouth on the self-portrait, and you can remark upon the fact that you love that you see them drawing a smile because they are someone who's always laughing, or they're the first ones who tell the funniest jokes in the class, and finding those ways to really just build that child up. And one strategy to do this that is really exciting, and I was really excited to learn about, is mirror sketching. So setting kids up with a mirror right in front of them and really inviting children to describe what they see in the mirror and zeroing in on each feature and what do they notice about it that makes them unique, that makes it special. And it helps emphasize that every child is beautiful and important, and helping them notice all those different features that make us unique and special. All right, so next slide, please. Okay, so we're gonna just give a time for reflection right now. We'll go to the next slide. So we've been talking a lot, and we would love to know a little bit about, in the chat, if you could share, what are some new ideas that you would like to take and implement in your learning environment to help young children process and these tough topics and these discussions. Affirmations during breakfast meal time. That's awesome. Love those opportunities where they're all together. Home art. Bringing that idea of bringing in artwork from home, artwork that they see every day in their houses. Yeah. Another, affirmations and commitments. That's a great one. I love that idea, the commitments we have to each other. Search for additional book titles. Absolutely. The mirror idea. Great. Yay. Paper dolls to families to have them dress the doll as a home country. Absolutely. Love these ways to celebrate. All right, and Laura just posted a blog post from the Smithsonian Early Enrichment Center about talking with young children about death. Absolutely. And also I know the Office of Head Start has some specific resources as well that are fantastic, including a podcast about talking about some of these difficult subjects. And then use our puppets for role playing. I love that. Great. Okay, so we're gonna we're right near time, so I want to make sure we get some of these specific resources out to you. So we go to the next slide. The next slide there. So we've got some resources for you from the Smithsonian. So the first one is an activity called Pictures of Me. It's from the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, and it's a guided self-portraiture activity that, as you can see from the example, is sort of both self-portraiture and collage. This activity has been designed and updated especially for Head Start with ELOF goals in mind, and it's from our Identity, Community, and Culture digital backpack from our Get a Head Start with the Smithsonian field trips and digital backpacks. So that's a great activity there. Next slide. The Introducing video series from the National Portrait Gallery. That's another one of our Get a Head Start with the Smithsonian partners. And this is a series of videos that was designed for young children to introduce those change makers of America through the portraits in the National Portrait Gallery. And what I love about this series is that it really takes these topics that these change makers have had to wrestle with and breaks them down in a relatable way and uses accessible vocabulary. So this is such a great, they're 5-minute videos and they're phenomenal. So that's a great one. And then the next one, next slide, please. From our wonderful Maureen at the National Postal Museum, we've got Stamp Stories, the Stamp Stories video series. And that's a fantastic program where Maureen and another Smithsonian educator meet together and learn about the diverse figures that have been featured on postage stamps, figures like Celia Cruz, Roberto Clemente, Isamu Noguchi, and more. And they read aloud a storybook. So it's both a story time and a great learning opportunity. And again, ways to celebrate those folks who have really overcome challenges and introduce some of those ideas as well as the others succeeding in those challenging environments and wrestling with those challenging ideas. Okay, and next slide. All right. So we are right at time. I know if people want to put any questions in the chat, we would be happy to respond to you directly. Also, if you go to our e-learning course, which we will be sending in a follow-up email, we actually have a Google form where you can drop in questions specifically for our Smithsonian educators to respond to and help with if we have resources or activities or ideas to share out. All right, and then our next slide. We would love to see you again. We've got our Get a Head Start with the Smithsonian. Our last virtual field trip of the year will celebrate Head Start's birthday on May 16th at 2 to 2:30 p.m. We hope you join us. That is a music and movement virtual program where we are joined by Pinky Jackalope, and Nick the Music Man will be celebrating the 5 senses and healthy bodies with the Kids Farm of the National Zoo. And we are so excited to see you there if you would like to join us. That is also both live and recorded. So next slide, we'll just say thank you so much for joining us. All of the links in the chat will be sent out in an email follow-up. You will also receive a certificate for the training that will also be emailed directly to you. And we are just so grateful for y'all joining us. And thank you so much for your wonderful work with these great kiddos. And Julia and Maureen, I don't know if you want to come off mute and say goodbye and say thanks.
Yes, thank you all so much. Also, I believe there'll be like a follow-up survey for you to rate this training. Let us know what you found particularly valuable, how we can improve. We would love that feedback if you wouldn't mind giving it.
Yes, and it's wonderful to see all the thank yous in the chat. It's certainly gratifying to us to feel like this was valuable to all of you, and we would love to hear your feedback and know how we can better meet your needs as the people who do such important work with the Head Start population. And thank you all for your engagement and your attention today. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day.